Hello lovelies. Unfortunately I won't be able to do my follow-up video on Zombicide today because there's a train strike, so my worse half is using the room that I would need to use to shoot that, so I can't do that today. Sorry. So instead I thought I'd tackle something I'm seeing more and more going on both sides of this culture war we find ourselves embroiled in. And that is a failure to tackle the arguments that people are making. Instead of doing so, there seems to be this rather broad tendency to make up what the other person is saying. I mean, almost wholesale. It's worse than straw manning in many ways. I don't know what you'd even call it, but to make up what they're saying and to not even to argue against it, just to scream and shout and so on. The screaming takes different tones depending which side is doing it. You might get paedophile screamed at you from one side, you might get racist screamed at you from another. But in both cases it's based upon this misrepresentation of what people are actually saying, the arguments that they're actually making. Just by way of example, someone who expresses concern about, say, the strain that mass immigration might place on housing, medicine, welfare of all kinds, and so on, rather than those concerns being addressed or argued against or tackled or dismantled by logic, reason and evidence, people will just scream racist at them. This isn't helpful. It doesn't convince that person. It doesn't change their mind at all in any way. In fact, it's likely to entrench them, and since they know that they're not racist, they're going to start questioning the validity of the argument that other people are racist, some of whom may actually be racist, but they're going to be a lot more forgiving because they're going to remember those times that they were falsely accused of these transgressions. And this happens both ways, and so both sides get more and more entrenched and nobody tackles their actual arguments. This isn't good. Now look, I'm not saying I'm perfect at this kind of thing, but at least I'm trying. I lose my temper with people. I'm only human. Some people's arguments are fucking stupid, and it's hard not to react in a scornful way, particularly in arguments around Brexit lately. But at least I'm trying, and that does seem to be worth something to some people, that I at least try to understand the arguments that they're making, the point of view that they are professing, and just merely being willing to tackle the arguments as they're presented is a big part of being excommunicated from the pseudo-left, I think. I mean, the fact that I'm willing to take the arguments that people are making at face value and to engage with what they're actually saying seems to border on heresy, but it's not like the same thing doesn't happen the other way. And part of the reason that I'm making this video is recent arguments I've had over the definition of terms. People have discrimination and privilege entirely backwards, and these are people who've been trained to teach, and this is what they've been told. And there's the same thing with the definitions of racism and sexism and so on. These terms have been defined out of all recognition, and part of the reason I insist on accurate semantics is so that everybody understands what they're saying to each other. But the fact that these misdefinitions are now so widespread and so entrenched, and particularly on one side of the political spectrum, it means that people are talking past each other all the time. They're not understanding each other, they're not comprehending each other, and this helps fuel into this same phenomenon of people not even addressing the arguments that are made. Now, it would be easy to go over an example of this with Brexit or Trump and fake news and all of these other things, but I think I'm gonna tackle one on the other side of the aisle. There's a video doing the rounds at the moment about an academic saying that we should accept paedophilia as an orientation, that we should accept it, that people have no control over this. And this is getting screams of paedophile and paedo-apologist and all the rest of it, but I don't think that's accurately representing what's actually being said. So let's, as an experiment, try and steelman the argument and argue against it. So what's actually being said? Outside of a fringe of a fringe, you know, the kind of NAMBLA people, nobody is saying that adults should be able to have sex with children, or talking about extending consent past certain reasonable limits. These differ by country and culture, but you've got to draw a line somewhere, but nobody's really talking about expanding that. Rather, they're talking about the fact that this attraction, this orientation, as they are putting it, isn't something that people can control any more than I can control my heterosexuality or my particular tastes in women or the kinks that I happen to have, any more than a gay person can, any more than a bi person can, anything like that. They can't help the fact that they are attracted to kids. That's just how they're wired for whatever reason, and a lot of these people are themselves victims of abuse, which is why they have this activated sexuality towards children. So that's really the argument, that they can't control this fact, and that we should be compassionate and we should try to help them, not by giving them sexual access to children or anything, but just that we shouldn't monster them quite so much, that it's better to have them able to be out in the open, to get treatment and so forth. Ways that we can help them cope with this problem that they've been given. You know, this isn't like homosexuality or kink or queerness of any description. It's not like that, because a child cannot meaningfully consent. So that's why it's different. That's why you can't just say, oh well, they're attracted to children, it's not hurting anybody, just let it go. That's not the case. That's not what anyone seems to be arguing for. Rather, it's more like arguing for the humane treatment and rehabilitation of prisoners. You know, people who have broken the law are still human beings and deserve our compassion and assistance to try and get them to the point of being more productive and healthy members of society. And so the argument is somewhat similar towards paedophiles. That is the argument that I see being made, and I can't really argue against that. The idea that we should be understanding, but not to the point where we let them act out their desires. But there are steps we could take, there are things we could do, there are ways in which we could treat them with greater compassion that would end up being better for them, better for the kids that they might otherwise victimise, and so on. If they're able to be open about it a bit more, however much it might disgust us, in the same way that incest disgusts people, or in some cases homosexuality disgusts people, so long as we treat them with compassion and we make offerings of assistance and help to ensure that they don't act on their urges, surely that's better. And that is the argument being made, but most people react so viscerally or with disgust, and that's not exactly surprising, that we don't get into those issues. People will just say pedo apologist and that's the end of it. Whereas that's not really what most of them are arguing. So if we steelman the argument, if we take them at face value of what they're actually saying, rather than assuming what they're saying or assuming what they're arguing for, I think the reasons to object start to melt away. Because they're not arguing for what you think they're arguing for. And this is the same case in a lot of instances. So let's take a more traditional one. immigration's a thorny issue, and it tends to get conflated with racism and all sorts of other problems. The rise of the further right, I think, can be placed fairly firmly on a couple of things. Firstly, the large rise in immigration. Secondly, I guess the loss of traditional industries and the withering away of the welfare state, at least in the UK. And lastly, and actually perversely most importantly, the way in which the left has simply accused anyone who raises any objections as being racist, which has made people more racist, or at least more likely to listen to racists. There are problems with immigration. There's just no two ways around it. And the arguments are usually that these people come in and they take our jobs, and take our welfare, put strain on public services, and all of this. So these are the arguments that they're making, not that they're bad because they're black, brown, yellow, pink, orange, whatever else, but that these issues exist and are made worse by their presence and their large-scale bringing in. So, rather than screaming racist, how can we tackle these problems and arguments that are made? Well, the statistics say that each immigrant pays in to the system more than they take out. So it's a net gain at the end of the day. The strains on public services and so on, these are legitimate arguments, these are problems that do exist. But that then becomes an argument of redistribution. Where is the problem then? If these people coming to this country are paying in more than they're taking out, and yet our services and so on aren't being funded to meet the increased demand, what's going on? Surely some of that wealth that they're bringing to our country should go into those services in order to shore them up. Instead, it's going into the pockets of businessmen. So the argument against immigrants in that case isn't really an argument against immigrants at all. It's an argument about fair taxation and the appropriate way to redistribute wealth around the country, between the classes, between different areas and so on. It's about the level of social investment that's going on. And if they are bringing that much more money into the country, why aren't we spending it in that way? See, the poor, whether immigrants or natives or whatever else, should be united against this unfairness rather than being set at each other's throats. There's the arguments about the control of immigration in this country in particular. This was a driving force behind a lot of people's objections to the EU. Yeah, it's an understandable worry, but it's not true. You can check the rules yourself. We have chosen not to enforce the immigration rules that we're allowed to under the EU for whatever reason, because of businesses needing people to work, because of the NHS needing people to work. It's nothing to do with an imposition, and yet if you don't have the argument, if you just scream racist, you can't point this out to people. Some people aren't going to listen. It's not worth bothering with. But if you at least make the argument, some people are going to be won over, some people are going to increase their understanding of what's going on. Cultural issues, these are another problem. And it's perverse the way in which people who cast themselves as being progressive have defended repeatedly the honestly backward cultural practices of the Islamic community, especially when it comes to women. And integration is an issue. People self-ghettoise and then stay within that community, don't mix with the people outside, don't become part of the warp and weft of British society. There are, of course, exceptions. This does seem to be a relatively modern phenomenon. So that's a problem. That's a problem you can tackle, perhaps by distributing immigration over a wider area so that people are forced to interact and integrate and so on. These are solutions you can offer, these are arguments you can offer against what people are actually saying, rather than just assuming that they're racist and shouting that at them. Well, there are going to be racists who pretend not to be, but you can't pretend to know other people's minds. You're not Professor X. You have to argue against what they're presenting, and in my experience, racists aren't shy of being racist, at least when it comes to genuine racists. And if people offer these arguments that you consider to be dog whistles, and you counter all of them, and they have no answer after you're done, then all that's left is racism, in which case you've exposed that, and maybe you've given them pause for thought, or reason to change their mind. So, just try it. You won't always succeed, but try and take people's arguments, whatever they are, at face value, at what they actually say, and try and tackle that rather than what you wish they'd said, want them to have said, or believe for some reason that they're dog whistling rather than saying what they mean. Give it a bash. Zang.
Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen, the collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.
Today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity.